Hello and welcome to Voices of Freedom, a Bradley Foundation podcast. I'm Rick Graber, President and CEO of the Bradley Foundation. On the podcast, we'll explore issues that affect our freedoms with a focus on free enterprise, free speech, and educational freedom. So let's get started. Despite significant challenges facing Americans today, recent research reveals a really surprising finding. And that is nearly 7 in 10 Americans say they either believe they'll achieve the American dream or they already have. Specifically, 30% say their family is already living the dream, while another 39% say it's within reach. And this is all according to Archbridge Institute's 2025 American Dream Snapshot. Yet, deeper questions remain. What's it actually take for people to flourish, and what do we mean by the term flourishing? Our guests today have dedicated their careers to answering these really tough, hard to get your arms around questions through a combination of research and policy solutions. Gonzalo Schwarz is president and CEO of the Archbridge Institute, a think tank focused on lifting barriers to human flourishing. Growing up in Uruguay, Israel, Ecuador, and Bolivia, he has witnessed firsthand how institutions affect people's ability or inability to thrive. In 2016, he founded Archbridge to bring together cutting-edge research with real-world policy. Clay Routledge is Vice President of Research and Director of the Human Flourishing Lab at Archbridge. As a leading expert in existential psychology, his work explores how our need for meaning influences everything, from personal goals to our attitudes about freedom and the future. Clay left a distinguished academic career to translate psychological insights into practical approaches for helping people live more fulfilling lives. Together, they're building a human flourishing movement that goes beyond the traditional economic measures to understand what truly enables people to live better, richer, and fuller lives. Gonzalo and Clay, it is wonderful to have you. Welcome to Voices of Freedom.
Thank you very much, Rick, for the invitation. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Gonzalo, let's start with you. I'll throw the first question your way. You founded Archbridge in 2016 after growing up in several different countries where I'm sure you saw varying levels of opportunity and prosperity, and maybe that's an understatement. But what did those experiences teach you about the relationship between institutions, policy, and human flourishing?
Thank you very much, Rick, for that easy question to start us off. What I would say is my experiences taught me, I think, at a broader level that people all around the world, certainly including the United States, are pursuing flourishing lives. It might mean something different for different people, but in a broad sense, it is about living better, richer, and fuller lives. People wake up everywhere that I've lived, at least, every morning thinking, how can I have a better life for myself, for my family? How can I achieve my fullest human potential or help my family or even people in my close community achieve their human potential as well? And I saw that being from Uruguay, which is not one of the poorest nations in Latin America, but it's certainly still a developing nation. And I saw it in more challenging economic situations in Ecuador and mostly in Bolivia, where I was before moving to the United States. And I saw that when I was living in Israel during my childhood, where I was there during the Gulf War, and we had 3 weeks in elementary school where we had to go to school with our backpack or lunchbox and a gas mask, because there were a threat of chemical bombs at the time. And I think throughout all those experiences and living in the United States afterwards, I saw unequivocally that institutions and policies that promote more individual freedom, more rule of law, and more economic freedom with less barriers for entrepreneurs created better conditions for its people and more paths to human flourishing. There are certainly other cultural narratives and attitudes that make those countries more suited to enable more human flourishing, but that, I think, in a broad sense, what I saw throughout my experiences.
Really interesting. Clay, you left academia after a couple of decades to join a policy think tank. Why did you make that transition, and how do you see the connection between psychological research and public policy?
You know, like you said, I was a professor for a long time. I loved many aspects of being a professor. It's wonderful to work with students and to, be able to do research and, kind of have the space to explore these types of questions that I wanted to explore as a psychologist. But one of the things I began to notice more later in my career was a lot of the more interesting discourse, I think, that was happening around these issues that we're talking about today wasn't happening in academia. And to be clear, like I'm not saying it's not happening anywhere in academia, but I was seeing it more in the think tank world, and I was seeing it more in other areas of discourse than I was in academia. And when I started working with Archbridge, first as a fellow while I was still a professor, I really got to see some of that, and I really appreciated Gonzalo's perspective on bringing a more holistic approach to the table. Which, as a psychologist, when you work in academia, you kind of focus on your own little field of expertise, and it's hard to have opportunities to work with economists or public policy experts because you're so narrowly focused in your specialized discipline. And I just really liked that idea of like taking my expertise and working with people who had expertise in other areas to really take a more holistic approach to flourishing. And Archbridge offered me the opportunity to do that. And so, it's really translating those ideas to something more actionable and more accessible to the general public is what I felt my calling was at that point.
Was it hard to take the leap at the time you were making it,
You know,
or
it,
not?
it wasn't a way because, you hear about like tenure, right? The goal of tenure. And
Yeah, of course.
I'd spent all this time like building a career there. I was a full professor. I was actually an endowed professor. So, I had this distinguished, pretty cushy professorship. But, I remember asking myself this question. If I said, when I was thinking about, should I stay in academia or should I leave? And the only reason to stay, or the biggest reason I should say to stay, was the security of tenure. And I was like, that's not a good reason. Like, that's not a good, that's a fear-based reason. That was a big change. You spend decades training to do one thing and it's a big change. I have zero regrets.
It's good to hear.
It's been great. It's been very intellectually stimulating. It's really helped me feel meaningful to, to do something that I'm passionate about, but to also try to do it in a way that I think can have real impact in people's day-to-day lives.
That's great. Archbridge, as I understand it, focuses on lifting barriers to human flourishing. And we touched on this at the top. Talk to us about how you define human flourishing, which to a linear thinker like me is a fuzzy concept. And why do you think it's a better framework than more traditional measures, simply measuring economic growth or income mobility?
As we're trying to build that human flourishing movement, the idea of human flourishing is a more unifying narrative, as more people are interested in more than just economic growth or mobility, even as they are prerequisites for human flourishing. Certainly, they are. We need that as the backbone of a more human flourishing: economic growth, income mobility, freedom, agency. And I think I would have tried to have a better answer than just, I think, Clay's previous answer, but that sort of illustrates that a lot. He, I think, had, as you mentioned, a cushy job at an endowed chair, and he was searching for more meaning in life and achieving his own human potential. And how we define it is very close to how we think about the American dream as well. It is about people striving to achieve better, richer, fuller lives. It's using one's individual agency to take actions and pursue aspirations, betterment, and growth. And it is, at the end of the day, having chasing the good life, fulfilling our unique human potential. It's an endeavor that's been out there since times of Aristotle, who started studying the concept as well. But for us, I think it's a more unified narrative that more people can relate to. And as we're talking about upward mobility in a lot of our research as well, as we see it, as I said, as a backbone of it, how economists usually define it is if you out earn your parents as adults. And we want newer generations to be better off, but whose goal is it as a kid or someone else? Oh, I want to earn more money than my parents. It is a measure that we need to have, but I think that that's not what pushes people forward in pursuit of that better life. Sorry, Clay, I don't want to get in your way if you want to answer that as well.
Yeah, no, that, just building on that. I mean, again, and I kind of mentioned this before, is one of the things that really attracted me to Archbridge and working with Gonzalo is this appreciation of a more holistic understanding of well-being or flourishing. I mean, when people go throughout their days, some of that time is spent worrying about money and thinking about economic issues, of course. But a lot of it is spent thinking about being a good family member, right? Supporting your children, being a good spouse, being a good coworker, being a good citizen, and having experiences of awe and beauty, personal goals and growth that, don't directly touch on your financial situation. But, some people have the goal of being in better health, of training for a marathon, of finding, of learning a new language. I mean, there's all sorts of aspects of human existence that economics matters to, but it's not the most proximal variable. So just as, and these things are interrelated. I think these different dimensions of flourishing are interrelated as one example. So by many indicators, Americans are doing better economically than than previous eras and compared to other countries. But at the same time, we have these growing trends of pessimism and depression and social distrust. And these trends are important on their own because, as I noted, these other dimensions of life are part of what contributes to well-being, but they're also important even if you only really want to focus on economic indicators or on things we care about in terms of advocating for freedom, because for instance anxiety and depression undermine entrepreneurship. They undermine innovation. People are less likely to take risks. They're less likely to explore new avenues of opportunity if they're anxious and depressed. Right. And so even if you only care about focusing on the economic metrics, the psychology ultimately and the social and cultural life ultimately contribute to those metrics and the activities that support economic growth. Of course, like I said, I think they're important on their own as well, but they are drivers of the types of economic activities and policies, I think, that we think contribute to a free and flourishing society.
So flourishing, I mean, there's no one definition. This is as defined by each individual, correct?
I mean, I think yes, in part. I mean, I think you can get some consensus around sort of what are the predictors of psychological, social, economic well-being, perhaps. But you're right. And that's why, you're right in the extent that this is also a very individualized pursuit. Your goals might be different from my goals. And again, this is one of the reasons that I think a free society matters, is it helps people sort of find their way into their talents and how they can contribute, not just to their own improvement, but to the improvement of their communities. And those are often very individual, distinct goals based on our personalities, based on our life experiences, our belief systems. And so, yeah, your flourishing might be different than my flourishing, but there are some basic things that we can say. For instance, most Americans say that family life is a good family is what makes their life meaningful. So you can find consensus around themes, but the specific ways in which those goals are fulfilled and experienced are very distinct.
Makes sense. Makes sense. I found this really interesting. Your research consistently finds that most Americans, and it doesn't across all lines, whether it's racial or income or educational, believe that they've achieved the American dream or on their way to achieving it in some way. But boy, that seems to contradict what you hear, the narratives that are out there. Somewhere there's a disconnect. What's going on?
Now, that's a great question. And that's something that we struggle with every day to try to push back
Yeah,
against those more pessimistic narratives, more negative narratives. But it's in a way, it's what sells. And I think a lot of it is driven by media, elites, politics.
part of today's politics. Yes.
Yes, that politicians, regardless of where they're coming from, they want to sell you their way of how can I improve your chances to achieving the American dream. Or the media, it's what sells for clicks. I want to present a more pessimistic narrative, something that catches the eye. If things are going rosy and well, people are not going to pay so much attention to that. But we try to do with our service is go directly to the public and ask them, what do you think are your chances of, have you achieved the American dream? You're on your way to achieve it, because it's many times a journey and not necessarily just a destination, or it's out of reach. What I've written in the past about it is that it's like the movie critic industry. A lot of movie critics want to tell you this is why a movie is good or not good. And when we check all the scores, we see the movie critics having very negative scores about one certain movie, and then you check the audience score about that same movie, the reviews, and it's a much more positive, score, much more of a positive review, because they're being entertained by a movie, they're being happy with it. And in a way, I think that's what happens with the American dream as well. A lot of this pessimism for movie critics, or in this case, American dream critics, it's what sells for them. But when you ask the audience directly, they say that they're more optimistic that we hear about in these narratives. One recent example, we actually had a poll last week through the Wall Street Journal and with NORC, which is National Opinion Research Center out of the University of Chicago, which is the same firm that we use to run our own survey. And I think a lot of it is also how people are asking the questions first of all. because what their question about if the American dream is out of reach, which is what that survey showed, is that they're specifically asking, do you think that the American dream, as defined by if you work hard, you will get ahead, is achievable, is true or is not true, or has never been true for people? But it's not asking people directly, do you think, what about your own chances of the American dream? And it's being very specific about what that definition of the American dream is, when it's a much broader concept, a much more holistic national narrative that I think we need to appreciate. So it's a disservice in that sense, but it's not asking directly. So a lot of the pessimistic narratives, even around that survey last week, came around with a different type of question. But it also gets to a second point that we've seen in our own survey and in other surveys that Clay has done with the Human Flourishing Lab, in which when we ask people about their own views about their own American dream, or in the case of the Clay's survey that he can talk more about, we ask people if they feel hopeful about the future. When it's about them, people are feeling much more optimistic. So in our surveys, as you mentioned, almost 70% of people say they have either achieved or they're on their way to achieve the American dream. When in that same survey, we ask them, do you think people are still able to achieve the American dreams? Only 51% of people say that they think others can achieve their American dream. When Clay ran that survey around hope, he found that 82% of people were hopeful about the future of America. But when he asked, do you think other people are hopeful about the future of America, it was only 56%. So the
Hmm.
perception of like my present or my future is better is very good. But if I need to ask, if someone asks me about others, that's a more negative perception. Maybe Clay, you can talk more about that. But that's something that we're constantly trying to fight against, because there is a danger they can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we started asking these questions in 2020, and other people have done those questions in the past, AEI had a great poll on that, or Pew or Gallup. They got similar results to what we did in the past. But since we started asking in 2020 to today, we saw more people being negative. 18% of people said the American dream was out of reach in 2020, and this year it's 30%. So people are becoming more negative, but that's the problem, that it risks of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't know if you wanted to play something to that according to your research.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely consistent with this broader trend of when you ask people about the state of the world, they give a more pessimistic response than when you ask them about their own lives. And I think part of that is what we're talking about, the negative media, because one of the ways we learn and that we gather information about the world is we consume media. And so if we're constantly seeing all these indicators that everything's falling apart and the world's on fire, then I'm not out there myself, so I'm like, well, I guess that's the state of the world. But the media can't tell me about my own life, right? Like I have access to my personal data of my day-to-day interaction, so it's harder to convince me my life's unraveling. And so I do think that's part of what's going on. And so, yeah, one of our goals at the lab and at Archbridge is to do a better job telling the more complete story. This doesn't mean we sugarcoat things or
Yes.
we ignore negative trends, but it's like there's a bigger picture, and there's a lot more positive and encouraging signs happening amidst these more troubling trends as well.
You know what, Bradley, we believe that we live in an exceptional country, and so much of that is based on almost an inherent optimism among the American people. And all this negativity, we think, and I think you agree, is a real threat
Yeah, yes, and that's what
to
I
our
was
country.
trying. Yes, definitely. What I was trying to allude in my first answer was that besides these institutions and policies, there are certain cultural narratives among different countries or cultures that portray, if they have that more aspirational, optimistic narrative, that certainly matters when people need to go out and build businesses, build institutions. And that's something that the national ethos of the American dream represent, that more optimistic aspirational narrative. And that's something that's so crucial that no other country in the world has it. No other country was founded under that sort of optimism and hope for the future. And so I think that's certainly very, very, very important to keep.
Yeah. Clay, I mean, your work shows that people's sense of meaning and purpose has a profound impact on their well-being and on their success. And you touched on this earlier. We are seeing rising rates of depression and anxiety, I think particularly among young people. What do you think's driving that crisis of meaning? And I mean, clearly it must have an impact. You've already said as much on their ability to flourish in the years ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. First, yeah, absolutely. Meaning is a well documented, you know, predictor of lots of indicators of flourishing, from physical health, like people who perceive their lives as meaningful just wanted to, they're motivated to take better care of themselves. They have a reason to, they have a reason to live, and they have a reason to bring their best to the world. It's a predictor of mental health, of social engagement, of economic activity, of wealth. People who perceive their lives as meaningful at a younger age end up making more money in the long term. Again, they're more goal driven, they're more motivated, they're more willing to make short term like sacrifices for long term gains. So it's just a really good contributor of a ordered life, of a self ordered, self regulated life. I think it's important to emphasize that humans have always faced challenges to meaning. Meaning doesn't just fall in our laps. Meaning takes work. And I think that's something that's sort of misunderstood sometimes, is people will say things like, well, you get meaning from your family and your relationships. And that's true, but it's from the work you put into those relationships. So there's good evidence that the biggest contributor to a perception of meaning in life is the sense that you matter. And the way that you feel like you matter is that you're in the game, right? That you're actually contributing. It's not like a passive thing of like, oh, people are nice to me, my family cares about me. It's I'm actually doing something to contribute to my family, or to my workplace, or to my religious community, or to my, or to my nation. Meaning's about mattering, and we've always had challenges to that. The fact that humans can even talk about this, it can even grapple with these questions, really speaks to the distinctiveness of this in our species, and we're constantly grappling with it. So I think that we're always always in a time of change and challenge when it comes to meaning. I think there are some specific things that we can think about. So another way to say this is, we might have existential issues that are unique to our time, but existential issues themselves are timeless, right? And we're always asking ourselves, what's our role in the world? What's our place in the grander scheme of things? But I do think we have some unique challenges. Lots of people have identified, whether you're talking about the decline of religious faith, lower rates of marriage and family formation, the stuff that we're talking about today, the rise of cynicism and pessimism, and honestly kind of like a form of anti-humanism. We're seeing this is, in a lot of ways it's fringe, but it's amplified culturally, this idea that humans were a mistake, or that we're destroying the planet, and we've done more harm than good. This stuff gets into people's, it kind of works its way into people's mindsets, and it's a defeatism, right? It's just saying, well, what's the point? And so I think those cultural messages are undermining meaning for young people in particular. I think there's also like an interesting debate happening around the irony of our affluence and success as potentially creating some unique challenges. And I'm careful to say this, because it often comes off as like, it's bad that we've
Right.
achieved so much success, and our like freedom has been so successful, economic freedom and economic growth has been so successful. But what I mean by that is, it's not that's not causing the problem, or technological and economic affluence isn't causing the problem, but it's potentially creating challenges, new challenges to deal with. And I think we're going to see this with, for example, the rise of artificial intelligence is one space people are talking about this a lot, because, if AI can do a lot of work that people, and this has been the case of technological progress throughout history, right? Like, you have machinery and automation doing work that people once did, and maybe that was like, well, this is what I do, this is how we'll see those challenges emerge again. But I think that humans ultimately are resilient, right? And ultimately we have the capacity to find new ways. We're creative, find new ways of making meaning. So that's kind of what I mean by, like, it's not just, oh, this is a crisis right now, this is an ongoing struggle that humans have. And it's honestly part of the recipe of our success too, the fact that we struggle with these issues, because we don't just want to be passive organisms that kind of say, okay, well, we're done. We want to find that next challenge, that next opportunity. And I think a lot of the issues young people are having, perhaps are related to not so much what they're doing, but what we're not giving them the opportunity to do.
Yes. Yes. Let's talk about some of the barriers to flourishing that you've identified. And your research has covered a whole bunch of areas, everything from occupational licensing to marriage penalties and welfare programs to decline of social trust. When you look at all these barriers, and there are barriers, how do you decide which barriers to focus on? And are there some that are more easily solved than others?
Yeah, no, that is definitely a big question and a true question. Yes, there's some of them that are more addressable than others. How we think about social mobility and human flourishing is that it is a life cycle endeavor, different barriers throughout a person's life. So it takes the whole life cycle of a person that what we're trying to look at. And why we're called Archbridge is because we're trying to build bridges between the different disciplines and between different areas of research that are, in a way, now I think siloed. There's a great article by Ronald Coase before he passed away in 2012, the Harvard Business Review, where he called to save economics from the economists because there was so much siloing of these different areas of research, a lot of connections. So we're trying to create those bridges, and how as we what we're trying to do is create a consensus around what are the main barriers to mobility. And some of these barriers could be artificial, that are externally imposed, that it could be government barriers to entrepreneurship or bureaucratic barriers to entrepreneurship. They could be bad education systems that we could solve through different policies, through more education, educational choice. Some of them are also natural barriers that are more intrinsic to the individual. Some of the things that Clay has talked about, or even if it comes to when it comes to family structure, for example, there's marriage penalties in welfare that we could address in a policy, but there's others we can't legislate or mandate. Hey, let's have better families, better family life. That's something that's very, very difficult. And there's a lot of organizations on the ground trying to help people one on one. And what we're trying to do is, first of all, highlight how all these areas are interrelated, which I think is missing in the literature. As I mentioned, a lot of things in research on different barriers have been siloed and they're not connected to each other. And we try to do that through our own index on social mobility, ranking the 50 states, where we focus on 4 big areas around entrepreneurship and economic growth, rule of law and institutions, education and skills development, and social capital. We think that based on the academic research out there on all these different areas and how we've tried ourselves to do original research connecting these areas to social mobility, but there's other great research out there as well. So we're trying to bring all of these areas, all of these pillars of social mobility and human flourishing together through this index, and we're trying to motivate people to address it and do an analysis in their own states. But when it comes to addressing specific barriers, like, for example, occupational licensing or human capital development, we try to partner with as many people as possible who are experts in this field. So, for example, we've had a great relationship with scholars like Ed Timmons, a leading expert in occupational licensing, where we try to show the link to social mobility, try to work with state-based groups, state policymakers in removing barriers to licensing. We've had a great relationship with our senior fellow, James Heckman, a Nobel laureate from the University of Chicago, who's focused on human capital and early childhood education, and try to highlight how it's the importance in early childhood in social mobility and human flourishing depends more in those early years. It depends more on the family and not so much in more schooling, not so much in universal pre-K programs, but more about how parents engaging with their kids. So we try to always collaborate as much as we can with different experts. We have so many different areas that we just try to lean on the expertise of others who have done work in this area and connect it to this broader perspective of this more holistic narrative and perspective on social mobility and flourishing. I don't know if you wanted to mention anything, Clay, with the work that you're doing with your fellows as well around agency and hope.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my area of expertise is less policy and more psychological. But the good news about that is, regardless of the state of our politics, I think we can make progress in these areas because, they don't necessarily rely on policy. Policy can be helpful, of course, but we can still work on changing our cultural mindset and our attitudes, regardless of what's happening in political circles. So, people who favor more top-down approaches that involve greater coercion or less freedom, I think can also benefit from psychological science, of course. But I think psychology is especially critical for freedom advocates, for classical liberals, because we want to maximize what people can do for themselves. We want people to act on their unique abilities, to take ownership of their situation, and to actualize their talents, not just to improve their own lives, but to make a difference in the lives of others. But just like somebody who's perhaps got like natural athletic talent still needs to be trained or still needs to be coached, humans need their talents nurtured, and they need their moral, social, and intellectual development shaped by these cultural, psychological, social forces. And so I think this positions us working in this space to do a lot of work in the broader culture that doesn't necessarily involve politics directly, but to help people, improve their own lives, be better citizens, better at helping each other, and better at coming to, using their freedom to come together around the aspirations that we think advance society.
That's great. Let's go back to young Americans one more time. They pretty consistently show up as the most pessimistic group in your surveys about the American dream. There's no question that young people today are dealing with unique challenges, whether it's social media, whether it's economic pressures, whether it's AI, whether it's technological disruption. I think back to my own childhood. I didn't have any of those challenges. There was a whole lot less technology in those days. But I think back to my kids. I have two boys who are both in their 30s now. Even they had far fewer challenges than exist today. Given all that, and I'm not saying that technology is a bad thing by any means, but what gives you hope for this rising generation, and how can we push them into a more optimistic outlook?
Yeah. There's a few things that give me hope, and honestly, I'm feeling more hopeful now than I was even a year or two ago, I think. For one, you only find what you measure. And so when you have a lot of public polls that ask questions about what people are worried about or anxious about, or you focus on negative emotions, you're gonna, yeah, it'd be great if a lower percentage of young people said they were anxious. But what these polls often aren't, or these surveys often aren't measuring, is what they feel good about. And so, for instance, we recently conducted a national survey focused on what we call digital flourishing. So we know that young adults and young people and adolescents are worried about many aspects of their digital lives, but we asked them about the positive side too. And not just young people, we asked everyone. And what we found is that the vast majority of Gen Z adults and Americans across generations have a lot of positive feelings about their digital engagement. They feel like they have a good sense of control over their digital lives. They feel like, they're connected to people. That helps them stay connected to people. It helps them express themselves. And so there are positive trends that I don't think we're doing a good job of measuring and amplifying, and doing some of that work ourselves. It's helped provide some balance and some perspective. It's not all negative. In addition to that, we've been doing some work on this concept called historical nostalgia, which might seem kind of strange at first, but what we're finding is there's all these trends, including consumer trends, of young people looking to the analog in-person past with great fascination. Right? They're collecting vinyl records. Young people, the main driver of physical book sales. They're the ones populating the local places for book night, for trivia clubs and book nights. They're trying to find hobbies and activities that are like real life that people used to do. There's this fascination with the way life was before the internet. And I think if you juxtapose that with their positivity towards like a lot of digital technology and innovation, what we're seeing is that young people are not trying to reject progress. They're not trying to say we don't want these new technological innovations. But what they're saying is like maybe we've lost something from the real world that's involved in kind of messy organic connections. And we're curious about that. And the way that they're exploring that is through nostalgia. And, technology is actually ironically allowing them to do this, because how are they learning about what life was like 30 or 40 years ago? Well, they're watching videos on YouTube, right? And then that's kind of prompting them to go talk to people of older generations, say, was it really like this in the 80s? Were you really doing this stuff in the 70s? And so you're seeing this intergenerational engagement too, thanks to that. And I think there's a lot going on here, but two themes I'll highlight real quick, I think, that are relevant for this conversation is control and connectedness. Young people are perhaps idolizing a past in a way that really like highlights their desire for freedom. They want freedom to explore the world without constant monitoring and supervision. They want the freedom to express their opinions and make mistakes and like explore different ideas without being canceled or ridiculed online, publicly shamed. But they're also looking not just for control, to take control of their lives, but also for connection. They're looking for those real life in-person opportunities to feel a deeper sense of community that maybe they don't feel online. So I'm bullish on young people because they're not I don't think they're the passive, helpless victims of technology that we often think of them as. I think they're wrestling with these issues in real time, and they're looking for solutions. And then back in one final note on that, like back in 2017, I wrote an article for the New York Times that I was looking over. It's been a while since I looked over it. And the article was about how young people are wary of freedom. And you saw at the time, it was all these issues around free speech, conservative speakers getting canceled in universities, and all that stuff was happening. And it seemed like young people who were historically we thought of as being very open-minded and wanting more freedom, were resisting freedom. We're actually wanting the administrations at the universities to exercise more authority over what they were able to access. And so I just thought that was an interesting phenomenon. But I ended that article making the point that it isn't enough just to criticize these young people for being insufficiently independent or being hypersensitive. They didn't engineer our security focused culture. We did that. And so I kind of closed with the point that if we want young people to thrive, we have to liberate them and let them be free to navigate the social world, to make mistakes, to fail, to experience pain, to learn to self-regulate their fears and anxieties. And if we want future generations to have faith and freedom, I think we need to have a little bit more faith in them.
Very well said. Well, let's close on an upbeat. We've been upbeat through this whole conversation. Let's stay there. Last question. You've both dedicated your careers to understanding and promoting human flourishing. As you look ahead, what are you both most excited about in terms of breakthrough insights or policy solutions that can really make a difference in people's lives?
Yeah, I think for me, what we're trying to do with our work is to lead a consensus around what are the main barriers to social mobility. Right now, the conversation is very politicized, is very dominated by the conversations on income inequality. That is not the same thing as upward mobility. It's all
Yes.
about how we fix the welfare system, tweak it here or there, or taxes or redistribution. And that's not what it means to remove barriers to upward mobility. So I think I'm excited that the work that we're trying to do is shifting the conversation to focus on this more holistic and I would say less siloed conversation on social mobility, linking a lot of these research areas that of our work and connecting it to the work of many, many others in the freedom movement that are worked in adjacent fields on this. So I'm excited about the promise that the work that we're doing is showing and helping state-based groups or other national groups to working on social mobility and now and into the future. But what I'm also really excited about, and I'll try to say it, I try to pronounce it, but I think it's a very challenging word, but excited about the semi-quincentennial of the United States. I'm excited about it because next year's the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I'm excited that and hopeful that the American dream can serve as a unifying narrative for next year's celebrations and that it can lead the next 250 years of American exceptionalism that is based on freedom, agency, and American entrepreneurship. When I moved to this country, I fell in love with the concept of the American dream as one of the most important national ethos that has ever existed and something very precious that no other country has around the world. And I'm hopeful that next year's celebrations can help people have that more optimistic viewpoint about the American dream, regardless of politics, the media, or other more pessimistic cultural vibes that we might have going. So I'm just very hopeful about that.
Couldn't agree more. Clay?
Yeah, just building on that. What I'm hopeful for is I think we're starting to see a bottoming out of the sort of attraction to cynicism and pessimism, especially among young people. We have a new fellow at the Human Flourishing Lab, Paul Antleitner, who's a religion and cultural fellow. He's a pastor in Minneapolis, also kind of what he refers to as a cultural theologian. And he studies a lot of the popular cultural content, whether it's the movies people are going to, the music they're listening to, other kind of themes that are happening, trends that are happening. And what he's noting, which is consistent with some of the other findings we have, is that young people are looking for a vibe shift. They want more optimistic, hopeful, wholesome, aspirational culture. And there's a number of different indicators of that. And, I just think that gives me some hope that that this kind of pessimistic, sort of anti-human, cynical, sometimes people call it postmodern in academia, those sorts of vibes are diminishing and people are exhausted with that. And, they're ready to feel good about their country, I think, and they're ready to feel like they have, something to offer and they want to live a meaningful life and contribute to a society that's healthier. So that's encouraging, but I think, we have a lot of work to do to realize that. And I think that's what we're trying to do at Archbridge.
Fantastic. Really is more fun to be optimistic, isn't it?
It is.
Much
Definitely.
more fun. Gonzalo and Clay, thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks very much for the incredible work that you and your organization are doing at Archbridge to improve all of our lives. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much, Rick. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. It was great to chat with you.
And as always, thanks to all of you for joining us on this episode of Voices of Freedom. Join us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts for our next conversation on issues impacting our freedom and America's foundational principles. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. I'm Rick Graber, and this is a Bradley Foundation podcast.